In this video, let's go deeper into Darwin and competition. It's the essence of Darwinism, and it's the thing that I have the biggest beef about. It's the least scientific concept in biology, and it's the most dearly held one. But before we start, let's once again just nail the Darwinists' feet to the ground, because they're really slippery characters, and when you start to talk against Darwinism, they tend to move the goalposts on you. So let's re-establish exactly what Darwin's theory is again before we start.
Darwin's brilliance was to connect what he was seeing with an idea from a completely different discipline, economics. Darwin seized upon Malthus's warning about a human struggle for resources, and he applied it to what was happening in nature. As more individuals are produced than can possibly survive, there must in every case be a struggle for existence. What makes the difference between success and failure in the struggle for existence isn't just chance. Nature's struggle for existence means that organisms with helpful variations tend on average to survive and reproduce. This is what Darwin defined as natural selection.
Darwin believed that there was limited space on the podium of life. Therefore, there was a competition for the spaces available. He thought that the reason organisms evolved and adapted was because they competed, and those that were best at competing went forward as winners. Once again, progeny has more offspring than the environment can support, therefore those offspring must compete, and the winners in that competition, the survivors, are the ones that go forward as the best adapted. I find it incredible that people actually believe this theory. In essence, what Darwin is asking you to believe is that all organisms are subject to Darwinian evolution. So that means that he's asking you to believe that, say, for example, whales have more calves than there are krill to support them. Therefore, whales are competing with each other. And that applies to everything. It means that there are more mosquitoes created than there are rumps for them to sit on and blood for them to suck. So therefore, mosquitoes are competing. It means that pandas have more panda cubs than there is bamboo. And therefore, the panda gets its specialized thumb for stripping bamboo because they're competing with each other for the limited amount of bamboo that there is available. That koalas and ants and everything are competing for limited resources just is so unbelievable. It stretches the imagination beyond belief. But that is the prevailing theory today, no matter how incredible. It is an article of faith with biologists. So what is the evidence that there's interspecies competition, that all animals are rivals with each other?
But yet you've got millions and millions of pieces of evidence which no reasonable person could possibly dispute. That's sort of the way it is.
The massive amount of evidence. I'm sorry, but you people keep repeating that like a kind of mantra, because you just listen to each other. I mean, if only you would just open your eyes and look at the evidence.
Show it to me.
That evolution is a fact, backed by undeniable evidence.
Except the evolution of animals through descent is not Darwin's theory. That's a pre-Socratic Greek theory, often attributed to Anaximander of Miletus. Darwin's theory is that Anaximander's evolution happens because of competition. And the more I look for evidence of that, the less I can find. Darwinists exclaim that you can't possibly doubt Darwin's theory because nowadays there's a whole field of experimental evolution, where laboratory experiments and controlled field manipulations are used to explore the evolutionary dynamics. The most famous experimental evolutionary experiment is the long-term evolution experiment, or LTEE, done by Richard Lenski. Until the pandemic in 2020, E. coli have been evolving in petri dishes uninterrupted since 1988. Personally, I'm in the minority in finding that Lenski's experiment is thoroughly underwhelming. The way I look at it, Lenski's experiment is actually just a breeding experiment. It shows you can breed E. coli using an acidic solution. Nobody contests that you can't breed animals. What Lenski is doing is merely providing a filter, just like any farmer would on livestock. The problem is that if you look closely at experimental evolutionary experiments, I can't find any that support Darwin's theory. What they generally prove without seeming to realize it is that breeding animals is possible, which was never in doubt. Darwin himself was a pigeon fancier and breeder, and he formulated a lot of his book on the origin of species by talking to breeders. What I'm questioning is Darwin's assertion that the universal breeder, the farmer of nature, is competition. I haven't seen a single experiment that seems to support that. Now, in the previous videos about competition leading up to this one, I was prepping you for this one in particular so that we could go over exactly what Darwin is saying. I hope you remember one of the videos previous to this one that talked about the Nash equilibrium and a zero-sum game. In essence, that's what Darwin is saying. He's saying that organisms are in a zero-sum competition with each other.
But there was a small problem with Nash's equations. They didn't seem to correlate with how human beings actually behave towards each other in the real world. When the prisoner's dilemma game was tested out on the secretaries of the Rand Corporation, none of them played the rational strategy. Instead of betraying each other, they always trusted each other and decided to cooperate.
Evolution has hardwired us for cooperation. That's the key to eusociality.
Now, this is an important argument against Darwinism. Imagine you have species A and species B competing for the same environmental niche, for example. Now, according to Darwin, to have evolution, species A has to compete. It has to be an intraspecies competition. That's the only way species A can evolve through random mutation and beneficial inheritance to overtake the niche and overtake species B. Now, if species A is actually involved in intraspecies competition, that's a zero-sum game, just a la John Nash. And the species involved should basically reach an equilibrium point, a Nash equilibrium, that means that it's a shitty outcome for all the competitors in species A. Now, if species B doesn't go in for that kind of competitive behavior, they'll actually be more efficient than species A. So species B should actually control the niche and win out over species A merely because they don't have intraspecies competition. So Darwin's logic is faulty. We're told that a house divided soon falls, but Darwinists would have it that a house divided just goes from strength to strength. Now let's just take a brief think about what happens in nature and if there's any evidence that there is this kind of intraspecies competition, that organisms, particularly organisms of the same species, are competing with each other in a race for survival. If there is a competitive landscape like that, well, competitive landscapes have certain characteristics. Now let's ask ourselves, does nature have those competitive characteristics? Are they common? I think that there's strong hints that nature's not involved in a competition. The kind of hints you get are things like, I'm sure that there would be far more horizontal spoiling if each one of the organisms was in competition with each other. In other words, there would be much more foul play.
For most animals, the reality of life is struggling, suffering, and death. There is no central authority, no safety net.
So what I mean by that is, imagine the classic bread and butter nature documentary about evolution, which normally shows the stock footage of a lion taking down a gazelle to show you that life is, all tooth and claw. In that kind of environment, if the gazelle was actually in a competition with each other, I would expect that there would be far more foul play. For example, one impala would trip the other one. I'm sure you're familiar with the old joke where two friends are walking in the forest when suddenly a hungry bear leaps out and charges at them. One of the men starts putting on his running shoes, and his friend says to him, "What's the point of putting on your running shoes? You can't outrun a bear even if you have running shoes." To which his friend says, "I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you," and then takes off. It's remarkable that you don't tend to see that kind of behavior. So, for example, you never really see, say, a buffalo when it's hunted by lions that, they chuck the younger ones out to feed the lion, or they, trip and push an old buffalo in the path of a lion. You would expect that if it was a competition between the selfish gene, they would soon evolve to basically push the younger or weaker members in the maw of the lion so that the stronger could get away. But you see very little of that kind of foul behavior, and I think that's a kind of a hint that Darwin is talking nonsense.
Biologists usually call that kind of behavior Hamiltonian spite, after one of the foremost evolutionary theorists of the 20th century, W.D. Hamilton. In a famous paper in 1970, Hamilton discussed the possibility of an organism deliberately harming others for its own benefit. Hamilton claimed that the reason you don't often see Hamiltonian spite in nature is for two reasons. The first is that spiteful behavior would result in revenge attacks and retaliation. And the second is that it would be difficult for an organism to identify targets for its spite because they might be close relatives. I find that argument absolutely remarkable because W.D. Hamilton is famous for also popularizing the concept of kin selection, which is the mirror opposite of Hamiltonian spite. The mathematics of kin selection was set out in the 1930s by the two prominent racist eugenicists R.A. Fisher and J.B.S. Haldane. Haldane, who advocated test tube babies as a tool for creating better individuals, was part of Aldous Huxley's inspiration for Brave New World. Referring to the cold calculus of kin selection, Haldane famously joked that he would be willing to die for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. The not-so-funny part of that is that it's basically a formula for jackboots. According to Hamilton's rule, kin selection causes organisms to do beneficial or altruistic behaviors to their close relatives in order for the selfish gene to propagate itself. Part of the mechanism of kin selection, according to Hamilton, was kin recognition. Individuals had to be able to identify their relatives, which was exactly the thing that he said wasn't possible and therefore is the reason why you don't often get Hamiltonian spite. As to the other argument, that targets of aggression are likely to act in revenge, it actually undermines Darwin's theory itself. Think about it. How can Darwinian competition come about if it results in acts of revenge that become self-neutralizing? The whole of Darwin's mechanism would fall apart and neutralize itself. It's ridiculous. As usual, Darwinists want to have it always.
Darwin's theory seems to be a universal answer to everything. It's very like theology that way. I think it was Bennett that said that it's a universal acid. It leaks out into everything. But I don't think that's because it's a great insight. I think it's because it's a pure tautology. It's actually a hollow insight. It's meaningless. For example, consider the logic of it.
Creationists often accuse Darwin of having circular logic. It's really a kind of truism, and I think for once they're actually right. Darwin's idea may be an appealing mindworm for some, but it's so shallow it comes very close to being a joke explanation for evolution. While Darwin seems to be explaining something superficially, with closer analysis it's vacuous, it doesn't really explain anything. In order to distance themselves from racism, fascism, and eugenics, biologists usually prefer to use the term better adapted rather than Fisher's term survival of the fittest. If survival is determined by fitness or adaptation, what exactly is fitness? Well, it's obviously that makes you survive. But that's still a tautology. A, if and only if A, is a tautology. These days, biologists just tend to get round the difficulty by defining evolution in terms of bioinformatics and genetics. The whole concept of fitness and adaptation is swept aside in favor of just saying that a gene is either fixed or undergoing change. But in doing that, they don't seem to notice that Darwin's whole theory has been swept aside. Where's the competition?
Look, let's be honest. Darwinism is just capitalism in disguise. So that means we can use the model of capitalism to investigate Darwinism itself and see if the landscape in nature actually has a capitalist feel about it, to see if we actually get the flavor of a competitive market or a competitive environment when we look at nature. Let's take some of the features of capitalism. Now, we frequently told by economists this lie that competition is healthy because basically it's survival of the fittest and corporations compete with each other and the best survives and that's better for everybody. But it's complete nonsense. Any investor knows that the competitive phase in a market is very short. It only opens up to resolve uncertainty. So what normally happens is there's a technological innovation, something like the internet comes about, and then there's a fierce competition to see who's going to monopolize that new innovation. In essence, it would be the equivalent of an environmental niche in ecology or in biology. So a new niche would open up, there would be a change in the environment, then there would be a brief period of competition. It's basically to decide who's going to dominate that niche. Capitalist investors normally know that the competition in a new area of innovation normally resolves into one major player with kind of flavor B. You get this kind of Coke and Pepsi thing like you did in the 80s, or maybe Intel and AMD, Advanced Micro Devices. Basically, you have this one dominant player that sweeps the board, something like Intel, and then you have the other flavor. Basically, it's the Microsoft and Apple. It's you have the major player, the 80% player, and you have the 20% kind of option B.
That 80-20 rule is normally called Pareto Distribution or a Matthew principle. There are good reasons for it, but it's beyond the scope of this video to go into it now.
So that's a kind of thing that you would expect out of a competitive environment as it matures. Now, does that appear in nature? I would say no. And also that would be surprisingly stable, which Darwin can't have. He has to have continuous evolution of the species. Stephen Jay Gould said, well, yes, that's the modern evolutionary thesis was that, well, it's punctuated evolution, but they need this continual evolution of competition. But the competition dies very soon. You see that in capitalist markets. You see as soon as a monopoly emerges, it emerges stable. Nobody's going to displace, for example, Alphabet, Google, that kind of thing today. It's very hard to bring a search engine that would even compete with them. So does that really exist in nature? Well, you can't have it both ways. There's either an organism fulfills a niche, in other words, competition stops and Darwinian evolution stops, or otherwise you have a competitive environment that then continues to evolve. But you can't really have both, and I think that Darwinists tend to argue for both sides of that argument. The next characteristic I'd point out about competitive landscapes is obsolescence. So, for example, if everything is an arms race, as staunch Darwinists would maintain,
arms races account for the spectacularly advanced engineering of life. Arms races can be seen in unexpected places. Mankind is certainly not immune to the nightmare Darwin called the war of nature.
Then you would expect that the battlefield would actually be filled with the latest gadgets. And that's where I think the argument for competition is weakest. If it is basically a battlefield, then it's a very, very strange one. It's almost like on one moment you would get Apache attack helicopters with the latest innovation in military hardware.
Mission successful, all sorts of carnage going around the battlefield.
And the next moment you would see basically a medieval crusader riding past on a horse with a lance and shield.
Whoa now!
The next moment still you would have some guy with a bow and arrow step forward right next door to somebody that has Iron Man technology. To me, the natural environment doesn't look like a battlefield. Advances in technology on a battlefield tend to make the older technology go obsolete. That's why the tank replaces the horse and carriage. That's why you don't see cavalry on a modern battlefield anymore. You suddenly get helicopters, and then helicopters will replace the previous innovations. Nature doesn't seem to be doing that. There's so many organisms that once established, they never seem to die out. If you look at things like Nautiluses are still going on fine.
The Nautilus is an ancient mollusk that swims around using a kind of aquatic jet propulsion. It hasn't evolved much since the first cephalopods 500 million years ago. They developed in the late Cambrian period and became a significant group of sea predators during the Ordovician period. And they are still around to this day. If nature really were an intense battle of all against all, then I would have thought that they would have become obsolete hundreds of millions of years ago, dropping out of the arms race because they're just so darn archaic. And yet here they are. I also find it very hard to believe that it found some evolutionary niche that it was so well adapted to that it never needed to evolve any further. And even more amazingly, once it had found its citadel, nothing else evolved to displace it from its niche in Darwin's war. The most likely explanation is that there isn't a war. Darwin was wrong. The same could be said about the coelacanth. It's also often called a living fossil. In 1938, South African museum curator Marjorie Courtney Latimer discovered a coelacanth, a meter-long prehistoric fish, thought to be extinct since the end of the Cretaceous period. It was hailed as one of the greatest scientific discoveries of the century. The coelacanth was also left behind by evolution. Let's not get sidetracked by wacky creationists who try to claim so-called living fossils as evidence that evolution is not happening. Evolution happens, it just doesn't happen because of competition, the way Darwin thought.
Another thing about monopolies, something that makes me very skeptical that there is competition, an all-out competition at that going on in nature, is invasive species. It seems to me that ecologists and environmentalists all over the world are lamenting invasive species coming in and taking over. But how can that be? Surely, if the orthodoxy is correct, and organisms are competing tooth and nail for an environmental niche, then how is it that an organism displaced from its natural habitat into some other habitat tends to become so often an invasive species that runs rampant? It's almost like a rank amateur coming from out in the sticks and coming into an Olympic arena and winning gold. How come that happens so readily? Seems to be further indication that there probably isn't a competition going on. Another thing that I would expect to see in nature, if there was competition, would be repeatability. What I mean by that is, imagine that you have, say, a competitive tournament. You would think that if all the players were competing, then if you repeated the tournament over and over, they would generally sort themselves into roughly the same order. If they appeared in a random order, it would probably mean either that there wasn't any competition going on, or the competition was a very strange one. For example, a Rochambeau contest where all the players had equal ability and they merely rotated. You wouldn't expect Michael Phelps to appear sometimes at the bottom of the league and sometimes at the top. Obviously, Michael Phelps is a champion, and so he would always appear at the top. Over time, that would be a constant, since all the players would have the same constant competitive ability. But is it like that in nature? What would happen if you emptied an environmental niche, allowed all the competitors back into the arena? How would they sort themselves out over time? Would it be a repeatable experience getting the same result? In other words, indicating that it's a stable competition.
On the 27th of August 1883, in one of the most destructive volcanic events in recorded history, the volcano on the island of Krakatoa erupted, laying waste to the Indonesian island.
Life on the island had been completely wiped out. That tragic event made Krakatoa the perfect laboratory in which to find out how species colonized and recreated an ecosystem. Almost exactly the same number of bird species repopulated the island as had inhabited it before. The species were different, but their number was the same.
The biodiversity was constant, but the species were random, which strongly indicates that they weren't competing against each other. In 1965, to further test this theory of island biogeography, Edward O. Wilson and Simberloff recreated the experiment in Florida.
We got an exterminator from Miami. We covered a number of islands different distances from the other islands so they could be fumigated. We could then carefully record the rate at which insect species recolonized the little island and their number.
The researchers came to the conclusion that there's an equilibrium in the number of species that can exist in a place. But the niches were actually filled randomly, which strongly suggests to me that the species weren't competing in any significant degree. One of the things that I'm a little bit suspicious about with the story of a selfish gene in a competitive world is I would expect that that selfish gene would hang on to life for all it was worth, but for as long as it could. It would try to be immortal, just banging out copies of itself as fast as it could and for as long as it could. But that's not really how it works in nature. In one of my previous videos I mentioned telomeres. They're molecular bindings at the end of chromosomes. They get shorter and shorter as the chromosome divides. They're like molecular clocks and they count down each cell division. When there's no more telomere left, the chromosome either unravels or fuses with another chromosome, but either way, it results in cell death. Now, it seems like telomeres have actually evolved, so they seem to be useful. But it's very hard to see what use a selfish gene would have for something so internally self-destructive. And the same applies to mitochondria. Eukaryotic cells with mitochondria, like all the cells in our bodies, actually have all the molecular machinery for programmed cell death or cellular suicide. They're ticking time bombs. It's hard to see why a selfish gene wouldn't have evolved to ditch such lethal machinery just as soon as it could. Another thing that's hard to explain is the paradox of female menopause. In more complex organisms like us, females often have menopause, and it seems very hard to explain from a Darwinian perspective. Why would a selfish gene deliberately cut off its reproductive cycle early? There are many theories to explain away the paradox of menopause, but none of them are really very convincing. One of them is the grandmother hypothesis, and that hypothesizes that as women get older, they stop reproducing and then invest all their selfish gene energy in their grandchildren. But it doesn't really make much sense. If you think of it from Haldane's point of view, they would have to have at least 4 grandchildren to invest in to make it worth their while, and you would think that it would just be easier to carry on popping out babies, especially when one considers that with sexual reproduction they only get to propagate 50% of their genes anyway. After a while, when you see these convoluted arguments to explain away things like female menopause, it starts to look a little bit like medieval clerics arguing about religion. It seems to me one sees so many scientific papers end with a statement that goes roughly like, which seems to contradict Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, therefore it requires more research. Instead of just saying the obvious, which is, Darwin's theory of evolution must simply be wrong. It seems to me that competitive behavior is quite complex, so an organism would have to be quite complex already in order to engage in such behavior. But that seems to leave a gap between Darwin's warm pond, where life was supposed to have started, and an organism that is complex enough to compete. At some point you have to get from biochemistry to a complex organism, but if Darwinian competition is the only mechanism that you have as an explanation for evolution, how do you bridge the gap between biochemistry and complex animal behavior? Now, no biochemist would say that organic molecules are competing, although I must admit that I did once
hear Dickie Dawkins on BBC Radio 4 claim exactly that. He claimed that you could see the biomolecules competing with each other in a Darwinian competition to evolve. But of course, no biochemist worth their organic salts would ever claim that biomolecules are actually competing with each other in a Darwinian competition.
This is the most fundamental biochemistry reaction. It's the mechanism of photosynthesis. If you take carbon dioxide and water and light, you can synthesize sucrose and starch. All life relies on this reaction, and our whole civilization was built on starch. Few people would actually claim that the carbon dioxide molecules are competing with the water molecules for light. At what point does competition kick in so that plants themselves start competing for light, as Darwinists think they do? But what makes the biochemistry of salmon, deer and wolves, the other more sophisticated animals, any different? Where does biochemistry become animal competition? It seems like a bit of a chicken and egg situation.
Since I'm claiming that Darwin's theory owes more to human psychology than it does to the evidence from nature, at some point, at the risk of being accused of doing ad hominem attacks, we have to look at Darwin's psychology and where his theory actually came from. At some point, I think we have to stop worshipping Darwin and claiming reflexively that he's such a genius.
The idea is evolution by natural selection, and the genius who thought of it was Charles Darwin.
If you actually take off the rose-tinted glasses and look at what he wrote, if you look at it objectively, what slowly comes across is that far from being a genius, mentally speaking, he was actually rather a bit of a plodder.
Darwin once wrote, "I believe I was considered by my schoolmasters and by my father as a very ordinary boy, rather below the common standard in intellect."
Dare I say it, it was actually a little bit thick.
How did a theory of evolution that seems that it could have come from a precocious 9-year-old gain such iconic status in the Western world? On July the 1st, 1858, when Darwin unleashed his idea on the world, in a composite paper with his fawning toady Alfred Russel Wallace, in a reading to the Linnean Society of London, the response was underwhelming. Not surprisingly, really. If you have a look at Google Books Ngram Viewer and search for On the Origin of Species, you can see that there was some interest in Darwin's theory after the publication of his book, and then interest waned until the 1920s when it almost fizzled out. What revived it was two things. First, the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, which did more to launch Darwin's theory than scientists care to admit nowadays.
In the legal battle that became known as the monkey trial, in a courtroom that challenged the truth of the Darwin theory of evolution. The result, a verdict of guilty. John Scopes was fined $100. Darwin had lost, and the monkey was on the run.
But the major contributor was that eugenics had suddenly come into vogue.
Its terrible misuse in attempts to justify cutthroat competition, even genocide. In the world of the selfish gene, what hope for the human species?
Eugenicists like Fisher and Haldane gave Darwin's theory a mathematical treatment that seemed to give it an aura of certainty that it never had before. Darwin himself was effectively enumerate and amathematical. I have deeply regretted that I did not proceed far enough at least to understand something of the great leading principles of mathematics, for men thus endowed seem to have an extra sense, he once wrote. Addressing of mathematics was irresistible to eugenicists because it bolstered their theory that if life was a competition, then those at the top of the social hierarchy obviously deserved to be there because it was only natural. Must mean that they themselves were the best at competing, and therefore the most deserving to be at the top of the social hierarchy. And they had the mathematics to prove it.
Not many people seem to realize that Darwin himself was a highly competitive individual.
Darwin once confided in a letter, "I hate to be wrong. He also hated to be beaten. He used to enjoy playing cards with his wife in the evening and would keep the score into the thousands and thousands of games. He once wrote gleefully about how he had thoroughly beaten his wife at cards and how much pleasure that gave him. All his life he was neurotic and suffered from psychosomatic stomach troubles. In the first edition of On the Origin of Species, Darwin wrote with almost psychotic fervour that the face of nature may be compared to a yielding surface with 10,000 sharp wedges packed close together and driven inwards by incessant blows, sometimes one wedge being struck and then another with greater force. The psychoerotic overtones in that piece are obvious, and they probably were to him too, because in later editions that piece was removed. Darwin's wife was Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin. He had 10 children with her. Only 7 survived past the age of 10, and 3 of the survivors may have been infertile. He was acutely conscious of inbreeding. One of the ironies of Darwin's worldview was that he was keenly aware that the cream of British Victorian society, the aristocrats like him, were manifestly inbred and hardly good examples of good genetic stock. And yet they were at the apex of British society, presumably because they had successfully outcompeted all their peers.
The word competition comes from competere or competo, which means I seek, I strive, I aim for. It's very easy to see why this gels so well with fascism and fascist ideologies, for example, the triumph of the will. Darwin seems to think that there is some elan vital, some vital force that strives for life, and therefore that striving is what's shaping the organisms by attrition. I think it's very revealing that the word rival comes from a river. It comes from, in essence, the idea that 2 parties are bathing in the same stream as each other. In other words, it comes from water wars. And water wars must have originally started with agriculture. So the mere term rivalry is something that comes from civilization. And that's important to remember, because you'll remember that Darwin got his idea from a Malthusian catastrophe, the end result of basically urbanization and where our culture is headed, and now where our globe is headed, a Malthusian catastrophe that then Darwin translated and projected onto nature in a completely unwarranted way. So this dynamic that really happens to doomed societies as they turn to culture and urbanization, and then it becomes doomed planets as we see today, that rivalry, that water war, resource competition, is the essence of civilization. It wasn't so apparent in nature. If you look at indigenous people, basically people that still live in nature, that idea of a rivalry in nature, that it's all about competition, is really noticeable by its absence. If you look at the Piraha and the Machagenga, for example, if you look at the Klong people in the Tsan Bushmen in Africa, they are people that are still living in nature. And their view of nature is the exact opposite of Darwin's. So I think that is revealing in itself. This is all about our psychology projected on nature, and it's the psychology of an urban battle. It's the asphalt jungle, it's the concrete jungle that really creates this rivalry, and it's not really evident in nature. So let me tell you this story, personal story from my youth, and it kind of illustrates the point. So yeah, I grew up in South Africa, and it was really a troubled time during apartheid. Our parties and stuff were really rough affairs. You know, there was a kind of a Crocodile Dundee atmosphere, I guess, is probably something you could relate to. As I noticed time and again that you would get these battles between essentially the alpha males of the group, a big macho, and they would go at each other mano a mano, and it was usually a fight over a girl. I noticed that it wasn't quite as animal behaviorist as most people think, including Darwin. But the idea of this clash of the alpha males that decide which is the strongest and the champions go on to breed is so part and parcel of our thinking in the West that it's kind of heresy to basically look beyond that and see what I saw. So the pattern I started to observe is that the alpha males would duke it out and then they wouldn't actually get the girl. If you actually watched carefully, the pattern that I saw was that at about 2 in the morning, you would see basically the rivals were normally drinking with their mates, normally celebrating a victory over the loser, or more often than not, the victor and the loser would have reconciled and they'll be sitting at 2 o'clock in the morning. They wouldn't be with the girl. The guy that got the girl was usually the alpha male's lieutenant. It was normally his second. So what I noticed this little weasel, normally the second lieutenant, would do is basically go and take his opportunity, go and sit with the girl that the fight was about and commiserate with her and say, "Oh, isn't it terrible, Jenny? Well, come on, let me take you home." And he would take the girl home, and he would be the one that got the girl. I saw this pattern over and over again. So I told my observation to a friend of mine that was a similarly geeky observer of human behavior, and he thought I was onto something. It wasn't long before he came back with a scientific paper that really blew his mind. What the paper was about was a study in Africa on game reserve of male competition, basically with impala. Now we're supposed to believe that whoever wins the contest then gets the female, and that's Darwinian evolution, sexual selection in this case. So this was the normal behavior that you'd expect with impala. For example, they all, in the rutting season, they'd all butt heads, and if you were making a nature documentary, you would film this, basically with the assumption that whoever wins the contest gets the girl. But what biologists found was when they went and tested this hypothesis, when they went and did some genetic analysis and looked at the DNA, they found that all these males that were competing and butting heads, they had an excess of testosterone, and they actually contributed their genes less to the herd, not more. And just like I had observed with the second lieutenant, the males that actually propagated most of their genes were the little Weasley ones. They took their opportunity in the background to go and service the females while these guys were doing their titanic battles. Basically the same thing I saw in human behavior. So for me it was a very graphic illustration of how you can be beguiled by this idea of competition, which seems quite right but actually turns out to be wrong. Now, no doubt, if you're one of these slippery fish Darwinists, you would say, well, yes, but it's competition, it's just getting more Machiavellian. So the competition is basically going from brawn to basically brain, and it's whoever can be the most Weasley, and they're the ones that get the girl. So my argument against that is, think it through. What you're saying, in effect, is the ultimate aim of competition is not to compete. The most successful competitive strategy is not to engage in competition. So Darwin's argument undermines itself.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play. What's it doing?
It's learning.
Know thyself. Who are you? Forces of the demiurge and chaos